as an executive, you're often put in a position of being expected to have wisdom, because, particularly if you've come up through an organization where you've worked in the roles that other people are now in, you've worked in a variety of organizations, you've seen the same sort of problems coming up time and time again, and often I guess you'll find that people will push you into this position of wisdom, and people will ask you for advice, and often you'll be happy to offer that advice because you've got that lifetime of experience to build on, and you can kind of take a snapshot of where somebody is right now or what's happening in a particular school, for example, and see exactly what needs to be done. But when people come and ask you for advice in that way, are they really asking you for your advice? Or could there be something else that they're asking you for? Are there other ways that you could perhaps look at this? So today you've seen and heard stories about what's working well, and you've imagined introducing new ideas into your own trusts, perhaps. And you've also, perhaps in seeing sort of sharing of ideas, sharing a best practice, you've thought, oh, that's interesting, that could work. Or maybe you've also thought, but my trust's different, or my experience is different, or we tried that, or something along those lines. So I'm sure you've had the experience of talking about a problem that you've got, say a problem at work, or a worry that you have, and you've been talking to a friend or perhaps somebody in your family, and they're listening, but they're responding to you with things like, you should do this, you should do that. And your response, I'm sure you've been in that situation of being on the receiving end of advice. So your response might be what? What kind of things might you say when you're explaining a problem at work and people are, your friends or family are saying, oh, you should do this, you should do that? What sort of things do you find yourself saying in response?
You don't understand.
Yeah. That was the very first one on my list. You don't understand.
I'm predictable.
I've tried that. I've tried that. No, I've tried everything. Nothing works. So you know how this feels. You know exactly how that sort of situation feels. And at the same time, you know that people are asking you for your advice. Probably almost every day people are asking for your advice. I think it's even happened today as part of today's program of activities. So people are asking you for your advice, your ideas, your suggestions. They ask you what you would do in the same position. What would you do if you were me? That's I'm sure a common question that you get asked. And this, so here's the illusion that I want to introduce to you and sort of introduce you to the idea of. The illusion is that you think you can put yourself in somebody else's shoes. Can you really do that? Intellectually, you will say, yes, of course, I can imagine myself in their position. I can look at the situation objectively. I can come up with some ideas, suggestions, advice from their point of view. But in practice, what you have to do is take little snippets of information that you've been given, and you have to place those snippets into your own reality, into your own life experience. Your actions in any scenario are the result of a sequence of events, starting with your perception. And your perception is distorted and filtered through your life experience. So what you're seeing, what you're hearing from me right now is not the same for each of you. Each of you is hearing something different, hearing different interpretations, hearing a different message. We know this intellectually, but it's a very hard thing to do, to really put yourself into somebody else's perception, for the simple reason that you have never been in anybody's perception but your own. That can be seen as a limitation. It's also a strength. Once we've formed a perception, the next thing is you'll make decisions based on those perceptions. Those decisions are based on past experiences and based on your perception of risk. Those decisions will be about avoiding threats as much as they are about about achieving some desirable outcome. And the problem with threats is that as a species, we're very good at ensuring our survival by avoiding things that might be dangerous. And it doesn't matter if they would not have actually been dangerous, because we're safe either way. And what that will do is tend to convince us that our decisions were right because we're still alive to make the next decision. Even though we may well have been anyway, but risk and threat and danger will teach us to be safe when we're making decisions. And then finally, your actions. And your actions are unreliable when you are imagining how a scenario is going to play out, simply because you're also imagining how other people are going to interact and how other people are going to react. So you'll say, right, I'll do this, and they'll say that, and I'll do this, and I'll present it this way, and then that will happen. And I'm sure you've all had the experience of mentally rehearsing something like a meeting, maybe a job interview or something like that, or a difficult conversation that you've had to have with somebody. You've rehearsed how it's going to go, and you've tried to play it through from different scenarios. And then when you get in there, they still manage to surprise you and do something that you'd never imagined that they would do. And the problem is we're working off a script when we do that mental rehearsal, but we didn't give the other person the script. So they're reacting according to their perceptions and their decisions and their mental simulations. So essentially you're mentally rehearsing the right solution. The problem is you can only know what works, what is right, after you've done it and then measured what the output is. And often we're under such pressure of time, particularly in the jobs that you're doing, to make fast decisions, take action, do something, and at least with some of the oversight that you have in the job that you're doing, to be seen to be taking action is often more important than afterwards anybody coming back and saying, was it the right action? Well, at least you were decisive, you did something, and that's better than somebody who sits around and gathers lots of information and wastes a lot of time and procrastinates and so on. And obviously each has pros and cons, and we tend to judge the effectiveness based on, did everything work out all right in the end? And as long as in the sort of organisations you're working with, there are a lot of people involved who have good intentions, they will make things work regardless of what your decision is much of the time. So I want you to imagine something. I want you to imagine that you give someone the most amazing advice ever. Something that's taken you a lifetime to work out, something that you've always stood by, like a personal philosophy. And you give somebody this most amazing advice ever, something that has always worked for you. It's always worked perfectly for you. And imagine that afterwards they come back to you and they say, it didn't work. What do you do? What's your first reaction? What is your first reaction in that scenario? What goes through your mind? What are the things you say to that person or ask them?
You ask if they did it in the way that you had suggested.
Yes. You check they followed. Well, did you do this? And did you do this? You check they did it right. It's confusing. Because in your mental simulation, that's a guaranteed foolproof solution. So when they come back and say it didn't work, it must be their fault for not doing it properly. See, when somebody describes a problem to you, the first thing to realise is they're not telling you about the problem, because the problem doesn't actually exist anyway. The problem, as they define it, is a set of perceptions about relationships. I don't mean necessarily interpersonal relationships, but relationships between information, relationships between rules, between lots of different things. So when a person describes a problem to you, the first thing to understand is they are only telling you what they think you need to know. And what we've got to remember is, for what I need to know for what purpose. The obvious assumption to make is, well, the purpose of solving the problem. But it's not quite that simple, because if you could solve it that easily, if they could say, here's this problem that I've got and I don't know what to do about it, and you say, oh, just do this and this and this, and they, oh, it was that easy. And I'm guessing from the age that we all are here, we've all had the experience of not knowing how to do something, and then a 12-year-old has taken like a second and a half to do it, and then we feel what? How do we feel when that happens? When you say, oh, I can't get this thing to do what I can't turn the TV on, and somebody just, a child presses one button or whatever. How does that make us feel?
Disempowered.
Disempowered. Old, obviously. Right, we think, I should have known that. If it was that easy, if it was that obvious, I should have known. So part of the problem we're working against when we give advice is, if somebody comes and describes a problem to you and you give them a solution and it's that simple, because if you can solve it but they can't, they're going to feel a certain way about that. And so are they really telling you about the problem? Are they really giving you the information that you need in order to solve it? Or is something else happening? What if they're giving you just the information that they need to give you in order to convince you that it's a really, really tough problem? They tell you enough to gain empathy, not to allow you to solve it. And empathy is not a solution. Now, in any sort of social group and the sort of environments you're working in are hugely socialized, very complex environments. It is very important to have empathy. Empathy has immense social value. But if you're looking for a solution to a problem, it is not going to help you. Because what empathy will do is it will tend to make you join them where they are, join them in the emotional and the mental state which creates the problem. Because the problem isn't created by the things in the real world. The problem is created by the mental and emotional state that they're in, that then causes some sort of disconnect or conflict within this series of relationships that they then describe as a problem. So them trying to convince you that the problem's really tough and trying to get you to join them in empathy with them and in rapport with them, means you're more likely to be stuck. And after a few rounds of, have you tried this? Oh, I tried that. That didn't work. I've tried everything. Nothing works. You'll probably just go, well, I don't know then. That does sound really tough. I just don't know what to do. And what you've done is confirmed how they feel about it. So empathy is great a lot of the time, but it doesn't always help us to solve problems. What's happened is you've watched this mental rehearsal, you've watched this mental movie play out perfectly, but you've watched it in your head. And in watching it in your head, as they're describing the problem, as they're giving you snippets of information that they want you to have, you've taken those snippets, you've put them into a mental movie, and you've played that through, and you've watched that end perfectly with your solution in it. But that mental movie you created using your life experiences and your supporting characters. When they said, oh, well, this teacher or this person or this whoever it is doing this, you're imagining that, drawing on characters from your own personal history, which have a lot more going on for them than just the bits of information you've been given. Now, if you were to focus on the decision instead of the actions that you would take, that's certainly an improvement. But again, those decisions are based on your life experiences. And in those life experiences are your risks and your fears of those risks, of those threats. So what if we were to share perceptions instead? And this is the earliest point in the chain of events where we begin to deviate from each other's mental maps, if I use that term that you're probably familiar with. So the earliest point where we begin to navigate off in different directions because we're literally looking at different maps of life experiences. So instead of jumping straight into, here's what I would do if I was in your situation, because not only physically have I never been in your situation, mentally I can't even put myself in your mind because I've never been in any other mind but my own. So instead of jumping straight into, here's what I would do, what you might do is take a step back for a moment and say, here's what I'm seeing, and here's what I'm hearing, and here's what I'm feeling as a result of what you're telling me. Here's what I'm seeing when I try and imagine myself in a similar scenario. And does that connect with you? Does that resonate with you? Does that fit what you're describing? See, in an executive position, you can't exclude the influence of status. People will ask you for advice, but they're not really asking you to tell them what to do. Might they sometimes be really asking you to do when they ask you for advice?
listen.
Yeah. To what end? For what purpose? I would say it's about empathy.
I
And
sometimes think as well, just thinking of a particular scenario, that they're looking for you to tell them what they've already decided,
yes,
almost like to confirm what they've already, they're almost testing it out to see whether you actually agree with what, and then when you don't, that causes a bit of conflict because you're disagreeing with what their advice would be in the same circumstance, if that makes sense.
right, excellent, very good. Yes, that's exactly what often will happen. And so when they're asking you, it sounds like they're asking you for advice, but what they're really asking you is what? What else? Anybody else got any ideas to share about this?
Affirmation.
Yes. What else? And I'm going to give a cynical answer if nobody else comes up with it first.
Are they asking you to take away the responsibility of making a decision?
Exactly right. Even more than that, they're asking you to take responsibility in case it goes wrong. So if you say, well, this is what I would do, and they go away and do that, and it doesn't work out, they can say, well, it was your idea. I'm only doing what you said. And even if they're looking for that affirmation, as David said, or the almost like the permission, as Sarah was putting it, as long as you agree with them, they can still put that responsibility on you, even if it was what they'd already decided to do. And so for them, that's going to give them a feeling of safety. That's going to give them a feeling of reassurance, of a feeling that they've got a safety net if they do something that they're not entirely sure about. So it has value. But it's this shift in responsibility that's critical. And I think in a leadership position where this status does play a role in this exchange of knowledge and exchange of advice, I would suggest that you think about how you can share those ideas without accepting that request for you to take responsibility, without accepting at face value, well, here's what I would do, or even worse, what you should do is. So if you're starting always with, well, what have you already thought about? One of the first things I'll say is, I don't know, which doesn't mean they don't have an answer. It just means they don't know how to tell you, or if they want to tell you. If you've created a leadership culture and an environment within which people know you're always going to catch them if they fall, they'll do less of this because they don't need to test every idea. They'll know they can come to you and say, this is what I'm thinking of doing, what do you think? And that's just testing, is there something I haven't spotted? And that's perception. That's not decision or action, that's perception, right at the very start of the chain. Is there something about the way I'm seeing it that doesn't fit with what you're seeing? And so the more of a safe leadership culture you create, the more trust you create, the more likely it is that you'll be working at that level of perception rather than jumping straight to the, here's what I would do, to the action. In which case, all you're doing is sharing those mental rehearsals, which then don't fit into each other's realities. So, as I say, in an executive position, you can't exclude the influence of status. You can't get away from that. And responsibility for if it goes wrong, if that's what people are doing. And I'm not saying that's always the case, but if that's what people are doing, that could be a red flag about the culture that person perceives themselves to be in. So what do we really need to do when we're stuck or we're in a situation that we've never been in before? What do we really want when we ask for advice? So for us, and for you in this Challenge Partners group, one of the reasons that you're getting together and sharing your experiences is to get different perceptions, to get different advice from each other, to share, here's a new situation that I haven't been before, and somebody else says, well, I have. And at the very least, I'm not going to tell you what to do about it, but you're not alone. And there's huge value in for somebody feeling that at least I'm not alone in this. That's immensely valuable. So what is it that you are looking for as executives when you ask for advice?
to agree with me, Peter.
You're right. What else?
You're asking for that. I'm not alone in this decision making. I might be accountable for it, but is this okay for me to make that decision? Because if I make it on my own, I'm carrying the whole level of responsibility for it.
Yeah. Yeah. What else? What else do you really need when you're asking for advice?
I think just connection. So you don't, because it can be quite a lonely role, and connection.
I think you do want a different perception. I think perspective, not perception. I want a different perspective. I think sometimes you do want to be challenged with an alternative.
So if we,
I'd agree with that. It's sometimes it's the sounding board, isn't it? You want to try out some ideas and get some reflection back. It then means really, are you going to, is it still about the conversation? Is an external version of the internal conversation? But you still need to do that because it's about a process, isn't it? In your own head and externalized too.
Yeah, and it's important to understand the difference between the two. Am I asking for advice to confirm what I already think, or am I asking for advice because I'm genuinely open to a new way of seeing things or hearing things? So that's so it's an important distinction to make and to reflect on for yourselves, I would suggest. So therefore, what's a different way that, thinking about what the reasons that you would need advice, what might be a different way that we can offer advice to other people when we're asked for it? And the suggestion that I'm going to leave you with as we come up to the end of the time that I'm spending with you today is to consider this, that good advice is not a recipe for success. It's not a guaranteed, do these things that I've always done and it will work for you. Because that person's life experience, the reality that they're trying to put that recipe into, is different. They can't understand how to interpret the instructions that you've given them. Is a possibility. So to consider that good advice is not a recipe for success. Instead, you might think of good advice as being a new set of stars to navigate by. It's a new series of points of reference. It may just be one point of reference, which allows them to, as Michelle put it, to shift their perspective, to see from a different angle, from a different point of view. And it isn't an instruction about what to do and the risk of you doing that because of the implications of status. The risk there is that they then run with that and then don't take responsibility for it. Because with responsibility, as I'm sure you're all very well aware, goes learning. We can't learn if we're not responsible. All we learn is, if I'm in trouble, somebody else will take care of it for me. We can only learn when we have responsibility. And so if you, as leaders, are communicating advice in a way that's giving people different points of reference that allow them to then navigate, it can be frustrating. And the more frustrating I find it to be, I find it's a useful signal. The more frustrating that conversation is for the person who's asking for advice, the more likely it is that what they were really asking for was not advice at all. So the frustration's a good sign, actually. But often I find that when what you're giving people is, well, here's how I see it, and then I'm going to leave it with you to think about, it can be a little bit frustrating because I just wanted an answer. But actually in the long run, what that person's learned is a new way of navigating through uncertain territory. And a lot of people have talked about change over the last year. The world is always changing. The world is always different today than it was yesterday. How we perceive change, how we perceive the rate of change, is obviously going to be different from time to time. But we're always in a period of change, and people are always moving through uncertain territory. The illusion is that they think they know where they're going. The illusion is that somebody thinks they know what's going to happen tomorrow. They think they know that it will work if they implement this solution or this advice. The reality is we never know until we test it. But as I said, I do understand that in your position, you're often under pressure of time to do something, or to be seen to be taking action, or to be seen to be taking control of a situation. And therefore, in that sort of scenario, it's useful to have a distinction between things I can do that make people think I'm taking action, whilst what I'm really doing is taking time to make sure I'm comfortable with the route ahead that I've planned. And that's all that we can ever do, is plan a route. Till we do it, we don't really know for certain where it's going to lead us to. So the thought I'm going to leave you with is, when people are asking you for advice, as they have done today, think about giving them new stars to navigate by, rather than recipes for success, and leaving them to figure out the route for themselves.